Hi, this video is going to be a short discussion about the different design aspects involved in creating and provisioning an Azure virtual machine. So when do we create an Azure virtual machine, right? So as we know, Azure virtual machine is an infrastructure as a service component in Azure. We create that either when we need to migrate the applications from on-prem as a lift and shift approach, or when we create a new application or a new workload in Azure, and if you want the control of the underlying platform, in the sense if you want to have the admin rights of the platform, that's when we go for an IaaS virtual machine as against a PaaS application service, right? So that's when we decide to create an Azure virtual machine. And let's look at the different parameters or the different factors involved at the time of creating the virtual machine. So if we keep these things in mind, we can be rest assured that the virtual machine that we are creating is going to be of the optimal design as per our requirement. So in this diagram, you can see that there is actually a virtual machine deployed in a virtual network, which has a subnet. Virtual machines, they get a network interface card, and then which is assigned a public IP. And then virtual machines by default get a couple of disk. And you can control the inflow of traffic by means of something called network security groups, which can be assigned at the subnet level or at the virtual machine NIC level. So on the right hand side, there are the different factors involved in designing the virtual machine creation. So the first one to start with would be the name. So there has to be a unique name for the virtual machine, and the name can be as per your organizational naming conventions. Then one of the most important aspects would be the size, the configuration of the virtual machine, depending upon what the virtual machine is going to host, right? So is it going to have, say, 8 GB RAM, 16 GB RAM, the number of disk, hard disk size, the number of IOPS, and the cost of running it? Everything depends upon the size that you're going to be selecting at the time of creating the virtual machine. And there are different size families in Azure. We have A series, B series, D series, depending upon the depth of compute capacity that you may require. Okay, so we will see that when we go into the Azure portal. Then availability, as you know, when you deploy your applications in a virtual machine and applications or services, you would expect the application service to be available most of the time, right? You won't The least that you expect would be for them to go down unexpectedly. So that means you will have to plan and you have to design for the availability of those applications against the virtual machine failures. So that's when you take care. You have to take care of the avail. You have to take care and design the availability of the VMs right at the time of creation, because you cannot actually place virtual machine, or you cannot actually uh, plan or design virtual machine availability after the VM creation. It has to be done during the creation. So there are two options. One is called availability set, which gives you instance level high availability, and availability zones, which gives you data center level high availability. And Microsoft has got its own uh, predefined SLAs for each of the options. Then comes the actual operating system. So, depending upon the type of application that you're deploying and the type of operating system that is required, you may have to go with Windows or Linux or any other kind of OS, and that can be taken from the Microsoft Marketplace. Okay, and the cost of using that would be the cost of using the virtual machine. The cost of the license of that operating system will be included in the cost of using the VM. Or else, if you have an on-prem license, that can be utilized in the VM by means of something called Azure Hybrid Benefit. Then, depending upon the virtual machine and depending upon the service that it is hosting, there are certain ports that needs to be open. So that is something which will have to be done. You have to make sure that which port is open and which not. So that is also something that has to be taken care, because you cannot keep any unnecessary ports exposed, because that will give way for attackers to do a brute force attack on the VMs, because security of the VMs are equally important, not just the infrastructure design. Then when we create a virtual machine, we get a couple of disks attached to it. One is called operating system disk, and the other one is temp disk. And in addition to that, we can add multiple data disk. So there are a few considerations about the disk type in terms of whether it's going to be a managed disk or an unmanaged disk, or is it going to be a premium SSD or a standard HDD. So we'll see what they are, right? And another one of the equally important, the most important aspect would be the networking part, because Azure virtual machines, they cannot be kept in isolation. They have to be a part of a network in Azure, and that network is called virtual network. So the private IP address which an Azure VM gets depends upon the network and the subnet it is placed on. Okay, so network helps the virtual machine to communicate with the outside world and also to communicate between the other VMs that you may have in your Azure cloud infrastructure. Then if you want to expose a virtual machine to the outside world, you can assign a public IP address, and that again, that's something which will have to be done after exercising very much caution, because exposing a virtual machine to the outside world by means of a public IP address, it actually is a kind of a vulnerability. It exposes the VMs to so many kind of attacks that can happen, like DDoS or other brute force attacks, DDoS attacks that can be exposed. Brute force attacks, in fact, that happens on the port level, but public IP address exposes the virtual machines to DDoS attacks. So we have to be very careful in selecting a public IP. Okay. So then we have different solutions for monitoring. We can make sure that we are on top of what is happening, not just the design, but what is happening on the virtual machine in terms of the performance or in terms of any kind of events or activities that may happen on the virtual machines. So we can enable monitoring and also be alerted if we are particular about any specific kind of activity or specific kind of event. Then there are some advanced settings. So advanced settings, you can have some advanced controls in terms of, say, if you want to do some auto shutdown or if you want some extensions, right, which are small programs to be installed. So they are optional, but they can also be done even after the creation of the virtual machine. So after having discussed about the main factors, let's head to the Azure portal and see them in action. Okay, so this is my Azure portal. I'll just go to the home screen, right? So this is the Azure portal, and if I want to get started with creating a virtual machine or any other Azure resources, I have to do it from here. So, so let's go ahead and start creating an Azure virtual machine. I can take it from here, or I can take it from the main menu bar and select virtual machines, right? And I can just go ahead and start creating it. And as you know that Azure, the deployment model in Azure is Azure Resource Manager. The management interface is the Azure Resource Manager model, and that requires all the Azure resources to be in a resource group for the ease of management. So we have to place the virtual machine into a resource group. If we have an existing resource group, I can place it in that, or I can create a new resource group. So I have an existing resource group called resource group 1. I will be placing it there. Okay, and then comes to the unique attribute of the virtual machine, which is the name, right? So you cannot have two virtual machines with the same name. So this is something you have to take care, and you have to name the virtual machines as per your organizational naming standards. And as you know, all the Azure resources has to be a part of an Azure region. So is with virtual machine. A virtual machine also has to be a part of a region. So you have to select a region. So what it denotes is when the virtual machine gets created, the virtual machine actually gets created in the data center of the region that you specify here. So virtual machine will be created in the data center in one of the servers of East US region. That's what it denotes. Okay. And then coming to the availability options, so said, which is an important one, and that needs to be done while creating the virtual machine. So have different options. You have the one which is availability set, which is which provides you protection against the instance level high availability, which is, so if you have if the virtual machine is meant to be the front end, suppose for example front end of an application, then in order to get high availability, you would always deploy multiple instances of that and place them in an availability set. Availability set in the backend would place them into something called different fault domain, different racks and different update domains. So fault there. So if you just go and check the availability set, that has got something called fault domain and update domain. So fault domains are, it's something which is relates to the Microsoft data center. So group of all servers which has a same power supply. So if something happens to that power supply, that group of servers will get affected together. And update domains are the group of all servers that can be restarted as part of a hardware update or an upgrade. So when you create if you have instance level high availability, that is your need. You have to create multiple instances of the virtual machine, place them in an availability set. Microsoft will make sure that they are distributed into different fault domains to protect against power failure and different update domains so that they are not restarted as part of the upgrade. So fault domains and update domains, which are part of an availability set, and if you place them, if you have two or more instances of a VM in an availability set, Microsoft promises 99.95% of high availability. You have a different option called availability zone. This is particularly for regions which has multiple data centers in the same region. So East US is one such region which has got three data centers within the same region. That means if you want to protect or if you want to provide data center level redundancy, so that if one data center goes down, you have the VM copied in the other data center, right? So that can be retrieved from the other data center in the same region. That is what is called data center level redundancy. So you can see that you have 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so you can copy it across your multiple data centers. Data center 1, data center 2, and data center 3. That's how you can spread across. And if you have multiple instances of your application spread across two or more data centers, then you can Microsoft promises a high availability of 99.99 percentage, right? That's availability zone. And then this is, as you know, there's a different concept called virtual machine scale set. So if you want to make it a part of a scale set in which you can want to control or create the virtual machines together, scale set is like a cluster, Windows cluster. So you can also make it a part of that. Okay. So right now, I'm not creating any availability options. And the next option, design option, the parameter that you should have in mind is your image. So depending upon the operating system that you want, right? Is it going to be a Windows-based operating system or is it Linux-based? You would be selecting your virtual machine image, right? You can see that if you select all sizes, you can go to the Azure Marketplace, which is actually a repository of one-stop solution for getting all the images that's there in the Azure Marketplace. Okay, so any one of the images can be selected and the cost of using the image will be a part of your uh, virtual machine usage, right? So for example, if my requirement is to create a Windows based virtual machine, if I select that, I can see all the licenses available for Windows Server. Okay, and the cost of using the license will be a part of my virtual machine monthly billing, right? So if I can select that. Say for example, I'll just go with Windows Server data center Gen 2. Okay, and that is the operating system I've gone through. And if I don't want to use that, if I want to make use of my existing license on-prem, I can use something called Microsoft Hybrid Azure Hybrid Benefit. That is here. So if you just come down, there's something called Azure Hybrid Benefit. If you want to make use of an on-premises Windows Server license, you can use that, and you have to enter the license details. That can give you up to 49% of cost saving. That's called hybrid benefit, right? So the next important parameter would be the size. So as you know, the capability of the virtual machine, the compute capacity of the virtual machine depends upon the configuration, which is like the number of CPUs, the memory, the hard disk, the input output per second. So all this again is achieved by means of something or categorized by means of they call size families. So we have different size families like D series, B series, compute intensive, memory intensive, right? All those kind of families are there, and you can as per your need. That's something you as an architect needs to be aware of. You have to understand what the virtual machine is going to be used for, what is the capacity needed, and accordingly choose the size. And then also need to remember that the size that you select or the cost of using the virtual machine is going to depend on the size that you select. Okay, so that's also needs to be kept in mind, because if I select something called D2S V3, it is giving me the estimate of using the virtual machine for for a month. Okay, so that's how you can make your proposals accordingly. Then a virtual machine needs to have a local username and password with which you can log into the virtual machine and and do the administrative task. So you just select a local username and password. And so, as you know, when you have to virtual machine, if you do want to do any kind of, if you want to log in or if you want to interact with the virtual machine on a particular service, they are all based on a particular port. So, for example, this is a Windows VM, and if I want to interact with the Windows VM on RDP, then port 3389 needs to be open. If it had been a Linux VM, then it would have been SSH. If they had been web servers, then I would have selected port 80 and 443. But this is something I can do that even after the virtual machine creation. But since this is going to be a Windows VM and we need to log into it, I'm just selecting 3389 from now, for now itself. Okay, and then as I said, virtual machine gets, when you create a virtual machine, you get two types of disk. One is called the virtual machine operating system disk, and then the temp disk, and then you can add a data disk as well. And there are two different classifications of the disk. One is the based on the input output per second. So disks are meant to store data. You can write data to the disk or you can read data from the disk. And the speed with which you do that is called IOPS. And that depends upon the disk type. Is it going to be if you select something called premium disk, premium SSD, that's going to be stored in solid state device using solid state device technology, semiconductor technology, and that is going to give you high IOPS. So you can see that it's give you a recommendation that best for production and performance sensitive workloads. Like if you want to host any, say, a database kind of a thing which requires very high reads and writes per second. So this is the one that you would select in that occasion on that occasion. Then if it is as normal, if IOPS are not a factor, then you can go with standard HDD, which uses your magnetic media, and that's best for your backup and not non-critical and infrequent access kind of kind of data. Okay, so and also if the cost will accordingly vary. If you use standard HDD, then the cost will be lower as compared to your premium SSD. One more classification of disk would be based on, is it going to be a managed disk or is it an unmanaged disk? So as you know, that Azure virtual machine disk, they are actually stored in the backend in the Azure storage as a blob, in the blob as a page blob. Okay, so that's a precise relationship between Azure VM disk. So they are stored as .vsd files in the page blob of Azure storage account. An Azure storage account has a particular limit of 500 TB, right? That used to be the limit. So, so if that means if the 500 TB limit is exceeded, you may have to actually place the virtual machine, point the virtual machine to a different storage account, right? So if you want that to automatically happen, you can make use of managed disk, in which the storage account limits will be automatically taken care by Azure. But if you do something called unmanaged disk, then the storage accounts, you have to specify a storage account, and the storage account limits has to be taken care by you. So if it is an unmanaged disk, obviously the SLA will be higher. 99.9% of SLA will be promised. But if it is an unmanaged disk, then you may not get that much of an SLA, right? And then thing to note here is Microsoft always recommends that if you have a VM with an unmanaged disk, always Microsoft will give you a kind of a recommendation to get it converted into managed disk. Because managed disk gives you 99.99, actually 99.99% of SLA, right? So you can just go with managed disk for now, and then going on to the next section of networking. So networking is an important concept because Azure virtual machines cannot exist in isolation. They have to be a part of a virtual network. So in order for them to communicate to other VMs and also to the on-premises infrastructure, they have to be part of a virtual network. And the virtual network they are in, the virtual net machines are going to get an IP address from the virtual network IP address in which they are placed. So here we are going to place the virtual machine in VNet 1, which is again has a subnet 1 with this particular configuration 10./24. Okay, so virtual machine is going to get an IP private IP assigned from this IP address range. And then if the virtual machine needs to communicate to the outside world, right? So or the virtual machine needs to be reachable from internet, they have to be assigned a public IP address because the virtual machine is going to be deployed in the Azure Virtual Network. And Azure Virtual Network, so if you want to connect it from your laptop is not a part of an Azure Virtual Network. So unless you have a dedicated connection by means of a site to site or say a point to site, then yeah, you can connect using a private IP address. But unless you don't have that, okay, you need to be connecting from outside. For that, you need a public IP address, and a lot of caution needs to be exercised here because if you assign a public IP address to a virtual machine, it is vulnerable to external attacks. So that is something we have to be very cautious about. So virtual machine will by default get a NIC level network security group, which will control the inbound and outbound traffic flowing in and out of the NIC network interface card of the virtual machine. And then there we have opened 3389 port. Okay, these are the main network related and related options that we need to be keeping in mind. And then if you go to the management part, then you can see that we can enable the monitoring of the virtual machine. So we can say decide whether the boot diagnostic needs to be enabled. So boot diagnostic are the diagnostic logs, right? Which is used for your, if something happens to VMs and if you want to do some kind of troubleshooting of what happened, that can be enabled. We can assign an identity for or like a system account or the VM account for the virtual machine by means of something called managed identity, and that will get registered in Azure Active Directory, the identity platform in Azure. Okay, so there are different use cases for assigning managed entities. We will talk that in a different video. Then options like auto shutdown. If we use auto shutdown, then the virtual machine, you can schedule the shutdown of the virtual machine at a particular point of time. Because if you keep running the VMs, suppose you miss to shut down the VMs, if they keep running, then that they will unnecessarily cost you, right? Unnecessarily consume your credits or unnecessarily bill you. So if you want to prevent that kind of a situation, you can do something called auto shutdown that will actually enable a script to be run every day at a particular point of time that you can select. Okay. Then coming on to a few of the advanced options, you can see that there are a few things like extensions that can be installed. Extensions are small softwares that can be installed in the VMs to enhance the performance of the VM. So these things can be installed even after the creating the VM. So extensions like your virtual machine, your backup extension, monitoring extension, your configuration management extension, all those things can be installed and they can be done even after creating the VM. Okay, so we are just looking at the main design parameters that need to be kept in mind while creating the VM, right? Then tags. If you want to have some kind of tagging enabled to the virtual machine, you can do that for cost management purpose. And then just you can go ahead and review and create. So once you click on review and create, it'll go for a validation for the different settings that you've made, and the validation passes. That gives you the cost of running the virtual machine per hour, right? And that's it. You can just go ahead and review your settings once again, the selections that you have made. And if you're fine with that, you can just go ahead and create it. And the maximum it takes is about a couple of minutes, and that's all it takes to get started with the virtual machines. Because if you compare that with traditionally with the amount of time it used to take to provision a server, this is such a huge advantage, right? So provisioning a server used to be such a laborious task. You need to actually go with a procurement cycle, then you have to have and you have to prepare your server, make it to the network, install the OS, and patch it, right? And then bring it onto the network. So it used to be such a laborious and cumbersome task. So if compared to that, it is so very easy and so very fast to to get started with the VMs. And also on top of that, you can automate the deployment of VMs. Automate in the sense, if you want to scale from one VM to a second instance of the VM, there are ways by which you can automate it, right? Based on certain conditions, automatically the VM, it's called scalable scaling of the VM, the horizontal scaling part of the VM based on different conditions. So that kind of flexibility also can be achieved when when you come to cloud and when you start using Azure. Okay, so that's the most most that's something which is the most advantage as compared to your on-premises traditional deployment, right? So you can see that right now we have initiated the creation of the virtual machine. It's just getting created and it won't take more than 2 to 3 minutes. That's all it takes, and it's a Windows server that is getting deployed. So you can see the progress of what are the things that's happening, right? So it's configuring the network interfaces, public IP, security, and then the actual virtual machine is getting created. Let that get deployed.